Hey guys, so in the last video I talked a little bit about the production possibilities curve and opportunity cost. So in this video I'm going to talk about how we can apply the production possibilities curve and opportunity cost to gains from trade, so why countries will trade with each other and how they gain from it, and I'll also be using this video to cover comparative advantage and absolute advantage. So let's start off with production possibilities curves of two countries. So let's say we have Indonesia over here and Japan over here. And let's say that they're only producing radios and rice. And you'll notice that I have radios in the thousands and rice in the thousands on the respective Y and X columns, or rows, or axis, sorry. So anyway, let's say that Indonesia can produce at most, with all of its resources, Indonesia can produce 50,000 radios. So that would be right about here. And I need to change my color. So Indonesia can produce right about here 50,000 radios with all of its resources. Or it can produce at most 100,000 pounds of rice. So that would be right about here. So this would be Indonesia's production possibilities curve. Now let's go to Japan. So let's say Japan can produce at most 400,000 radios. So that would be up here. And it can produce at most 100,000 pounds of rice with all of its resources. So the production possibilities curve would be drawn from 400,000 to 100,000, so it would look like that. Now let's look at opportunity costs for both countries. So we know that the opportunity cost of producing 50,000 radios for Indonesia is 100,000 pounds of rice, right? Because we know that Indonesia can either allocate all of its resources to produce 50,000 radios, or it can allocate all the resources to produce 100,000 pounds of rice. So if it decides to produce 50,000 radios, it is essentially giving up the 100,000 pounds of rice. So we can use this ratio and divide both sides by 50,000 to get the opportunity cost of one radio. So 50,000 divided by 50,000 is one radio, and 100,000 divided by 50,000 gives us the opportunity cost of one radio is 2 pounds of rice. Now you can do the same thing for rice and divide both sides by 100,000. So 100,000 divided by 100,000, well, that would give us 1 pound of rice. So the opportunity cost of 1 pound of rice would be 50,000 divided by 100,000, which would give us 1/2 of a radio. Now let's do the same thing for Japan. So we said Japan can produce 400,000 radios. So the opportunity cost of 400,000 radios would be the 100,000 pounds of rice, because it can either produce 400,000 radios or it can produce 100,000 pounds of rice. So if it's producing the 400,000 radios, it's essentially giving up the 100,000 pounds of rice. So the opportunity cost of 400,000 radios is 100,000 pounds of rice. So we can apply the same method here. So divide both sides by 400,000 to get the opportunity cost of one radio is 1/4 of a pound of rice. And you can divide both sides by 100,000 to get that the opportunity cost of 1 pound of rice is 4 radios for Japan. Now I'm going to make this into a little table, and I suggest you do the same for most of your economics problems, like these kinds of problems. So we're going to draw a rectangle like this and divide it into 4 parts. So let's say that this is Japan, this is Indonesia, and this is the opportunity cost for 1 more pound of rice for Japan and Indonesia, and this is the opportunity cost for 1 more radio for Japan and Indonesia. So basically we're just going to plug in the data we have up here. So the opportunity cost of 1 more pound of rice for Japan, as we see over here, is 4 radios. So just write 4 radios. And the opportunity cost of 1 more pound of rice for Indonesia is 1/2 of a radio. So we can write that in here. And the opportunity cost of 1 radio for Japan, as we saw up here, is 1/4 of a pound of rice. So 1/4 pound of rice. And the opportunity cost of 1 radio for Indonesia is 2 pounds of rice. So 2 pounds of rice. So we have our little table here, and now you can see clearly that the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of rice for Japan is 4 radios, and the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of rice for Indonesia is 1/2 of a radio. So we see that the opportunity cost for producing rice is much higher for Japan than it is for Indonesia. So in this case, we would say that Indonesia has the comparative advantage in producing rice, because comparative advantage is just when one place or country, like Indonesia in this case, has a lower opportunity cost for producing a certain good. So we say that Indonesia has a comparative advantage in producing rice. Now look at radios. Japan only has to give up 1/4 of a pound of rice to produce one radio, and Indonesia has to give up 2 pounds of rice to produce one radio. So the opportunity cost for Indonesia to produce radios is higher than the opportunity cost for Japan to produce radios. So we would say that Japan has the comparative advantage in producing radios. Now let's look at absolute advantage. So absolute advantage. So absolute advantage is just when one country can use all of its resources to produce more of a good than another country. So let's look at this. Indonesia can only produce 50,000 radios with all of its resources, and Japan can produce 400,000 radios with all of its resources. So in this case, we would say that Japan has the absolute advantage in producing radios just because it can produce more in total with all of its resources. Now notice that both countries can only produce 100,000 pounds of rice with all of their resources. So in this case, neither country has an absolute advantage in production of rice. Now let's look at trade. So because the opportunity cost of producing rice is much higher for Japan than it is for Indonesia, and the opportunity cost of producing one radio is much higher for Indonesia than it is for Japan, we can look at this like this. So if each country specializes in the production of one of these goods, rather than just be trying to be self-sustaining and produce both of these goods, they can both gain from the trade. So because Indonesia has the comparative advantage in producing rice, we can assume that in this international trade that takes place between these two countries, Indonesia would want to produce rice because it's giving up less, and Japan would want to produce radios for this trade because it's giving up less. So let's look at the terms of this trade. So we know that Indonesia is producing rice, so let's say one rice here. So the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of rice for Indonesia is half of a radio. So we know that for the terms of the trade, Indonesia is not going to accept anything less than half of a radio for 1 pound of rice, right? Because why would they accept anything less when they could produce more than 1/2 of a radio, or 1/2 of a radio for this 1 pound of rice for the resources? So Indonesia is not going to accept anything less than 1/2 of a radio for 1 pound of rice in these terms of trade. And Japan up here is 4 radios for 1 pound of rice. So Japan's not going to give anything more than 4 radios for 1 pound of rice. And this should make sense to you because Japan can use its resources to produce these 4 radios to produce this 1 pound of rice. So why would it give more radios for this 1 pound of rice? Now you can kind of do the same thing for radios. So we know Japan's going to be producing radios. So 1 radio. And now we know Japan is not going to take anything less than 1/4 of a pound of rice for 1 radio, right? Because it can use the resources to produce this radio to produce 1/4 of a pound of rice. So it doesn't gain anything if it's accepting anything less than 1/4 of a pound of rice for its 1 radio. And we can say that Indonesia is not going to give anything more than 2 pounds of rice for this radio. So we can say that Indonesia is not going to give anything more than 2 pounds of rice because with the resources that it uses to produce this rice, it could have produced a radio. So if it gives more than 2 pounds of rice, it could have produced more than 1 radio. So why would it accept anything less? So this is an example of how you can calculate the gains from trade, and I hope, and like the terms of trade between two countries, and I hope you understand the comparative advantage and absolute advantage and why countries would gain from trade. So I'll see you in the next video. If you want more examples on this, just comment below.